Chapter 8, actually starting on 145, managing emotional flashbacks. So I suppose that means when you're an emotional flashback on the internal model, deaf, dumb, blind, so the other two senses of touch and taste. Internal emotional flashbacks you with touch and taste senses. Chapter 8, managing emotional flashbacks. Emotional flashbacks are intensely disturbing regressions, amygdala hijacks, to the overwhelming feeling states of your childhood abandonment. When you are stuck in a flashback, fear, shame, and or depression can dominate your experience. These are some common experiences of being in an emotional flashback. You feel little, fragile and helpless. Everything feels too hard. Life's too scary. Emotional flashbacks are intensely disturbing regressions, amygdala hijacks, to the overwhelming feeling states of your childhood abandonment. When you are stuck in a flashback, fear, shame, and or depression can dominate your experience. These are some common experiences of being in an emotional flashback. You feel little, fragile, and helpless. Everything feels too hard. Life's too scary. Being seen feels excruciatingly vulnerable. Your battery seems to be dead. In the worst flashbacks, an apocalypse feels like it will imminently be upon you. When you are trapped in a flashback, you are reliving the worst emotional times of your childhood. Everything feels overwhelming and confusing, especially because there are rarely any visual components to a CPTSD flashback. This is because, as Goleman's work shows, amygdala hijackings are intense reactions in the memory part of the brain that override the rational brain. These reactions occur in the brains of people who have been triggered into a 4F reaction so often that minor events can now trigger them into a panicky state. This is a list of 13 practical steps for helping yourself to manage an emotional flashback. 13 steps for managing emotional flashbacks. Focus on bold print when flashback is active. 1. Say to yourself, I am having a flashback. Flashbacks take you into a timeless part of the psyche that feels as helpless, hopeless, and surrounded by danger as you were in childhood. The feelings and sensations you are experiencing are past memories that cannot hurt you now. 2. Remind yourself, I feel afraid, but I am not in danger. I am safe now, here, in the present. Remember, you are now in the safety of the present, far from the danger of the past. 3. Own your right. Need to have boundaries. Remind yourself that you do not have to allow anyone to mistreat you. You are free to leave dangerous situations and protest unfair behaviour. 4. 4. Speak reassuringly to the inner child. The child needs to know that you love her, him, unconditionally, that she, he can come to you for comfort and protection when she or he feels lost and scared. 5. Deconstruct eternity thinking. In childhood, fear and abandonment felt endless. A safer future was unimaginable. Remember, this flashback will pass, as it always has before. Remind yourself that you are in an adult body with allies, skills and resources to protect you that you never had as a child. Feeling small and fragile is a sign of a flashback. Ease back into your body. Fear launches you into heady worrying or numbing and spacing out. 7a. Gently ask your body to relax. Feel each of your major muscle groups and softly encourage them to relax. Tightened muscles send false danger signals to your brain. B. Breathe deeply and slowly. Holding your breath also signals danger. C. Slow down. Rushing presses your brain's flight response button. D. Find a safe place to unwind and soothe yourself. Wrap yourself in a blanket, hold a pillow or a stuffed animal, lay down on your bed or in a closet or in the bath, take a nap. E. Feel the fear in your body without reacting to it. Fear is just an energy in your body. It cannot hurt you if you do not run from it. 8. Resist the inner critic's drasticizing and repatterning, chase it. G, n, e, z, e, h, p, o, r, t, s, a, t, a, k, curly k. G, n, e, z, e, h, p, o, r, t, s, a, t, a, curly k. G, n, I, z, I, h, p, o, r, t, s, a, t, a, curly c. Curly c. C, C, A, T, A, S, T, R, O, P, H, I, Z, I, N, G. Catastrophizing. Resist the inner critics, drasticizing and catastrophizing. A. Use thought stopping to halt the critic's endless exaggerations of danger and its constant planning to control the uncontrollable. Refuse to shame, hate or abandon yourself. Channel the anger of self-attack into saying no to your critic's unfair self-criticism. B. Use thought substitution and thought correction to replace negative thinking with a memorised list of your qualities and accomplishments. 9. Allow yourself to grieve. Flashbacks are opportunities to release old, unexpressed feelings of fear, hurt and abandonment. Validate and soothe your child's past experience of helplessness and hopelessness. Healthy grieving can turn your tears into self-compassion and your anger into self-protection. 10. Cultivate safe relationships and seek support. Take time alone when you need it, but don't let shame isolate you. Feeling shame doesn't mean you are shameful. Educate your intimates about flashbacks and ask them to help you talk and feel your way through them. 11. Learn to identify the types of triggers that led to flashbacks. Avoid unsafe people, places, activities, and triggering mental processes Practice preventative maintenance with these steps when triggering situations are unavoidable. 12. Figure out what you are flashing back to. Flashbacks are opportunities to discover, validate and heal your wounds from the past abuse and abandonment. They also point you to still unmet developmental needs and can provide you with motivation to get them met. 13. Be patient with a slow recovery process. It takes time in the present to become de-adrenalized. Ooh. Oh. Ooh. Oh. 10. Cultivate safe relationships and seek support. Take time alone when you need it, but don't let shame isolate you. Feeling shame doesn't mean you are shameful. Educate your intimates about flashbacks and ask them to help you talk and feel your way through them. 11. Learn to identify the types of triggers that led to flashbacks. Avoid unsafe people, places, activities, and triggering mental processes. Practice preventative maintenance with these steps when triggering situations are unavoidable. 12. Figure out what you are flashing back to. Flashbacks are opportunities to discover, validate and heal your wounds from past abuse and abandonment. They also point you to your still unmet developmental needs and can provide you with motivation to get them met. 13. Be patient with a slow recovery process. Lemon and honey. Morning. Lemon's the only food with the same molecular structure as, guess what? Yes, love your liver. Give your liver a helping hand. Have that fresh lemon and honey in the morning, first thing before anything else. Buy raw honey now. Don't add hot water to it, you'll kill it, bacteria. 13. Be patient with a slow recovery process. It takes time in the present to become de-energized. Rain on me. It's all about the forks, the forking forks. What about the forks, the forking forks? 2, 4, 6, 8, 4, 2, 4, 6, 8, 8, 6, 4, 2, 8, 6, 4, 2, 8, 6, 4, 2, 2, 4, 6, 8. Who do we appreciate? The forking fork, tuning forks, the forking fork, tuning forks. Feeling hopeful. An attitude of gratitude, attitude of gratitude, attitude of gratitude. Being patient, number 13. Be patient with a slow recovery process. It takes time in the present to become de-adrenalized and considerable time in the future to gradually decrease the intensity, duration and frequency of flashbacks. Real recovery is a gradually progressive process, often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Not an attained salvation fantasy. Don't beat yourself up for having a flashback. My clients who post this somewhere conspicuous until they memorise the gist of it typically progress more rapidly in their recovery. You can easily print out a copy from the 13 steps page of my website, www.petewalker.com. Triggers and emotional flashbacks. A trigger is an external or internal stimulus that activates us into an emotional flashback. This often occurs on a subliminal level, outside the boundaries of normal consciousness. Recognising what triggers us can therefore be difficult. Nonetheless, becoming increasingly mindful of our triggers is crucial because it sometimes allows us to avoid flashback-inducing people, situations and behaviours. External triggers are people, places, things, events, facial expressions, styles of communication, etc., that remind us of our original trauma in a way that flashes us back into the painful feelings of those times. Here are some examples of powerful and common triggers. Revisiting your parents. Seeing someone who resembles a childhood abuser. Experiencing the anniversary of an especially traumatic event. Hearing someone use a parent's shaming tone or voice or turn of phrase. Many triggers, however, are not so explicit. Sometimes all unknown adults can trigger us into fear even when there is no resemblance to our original abusers. I still occasionally feel triggered when I come across a group of teenagers because I grew up in a neighbourhood where there were many violent ones. For this reason, my son, who is quite empathetic, joked that he will not become a teenager when he grows up. Sometimes someone looking at us or even noticing us can trigger us into fear and toxic shame. One of my clients once came in intensely triggered because a cat was staring at him. Other common triggers include making a mistake, asking for help, or having to speak in front of a group of people. She takes a pie. Many triggers, however, are not so explicit. Sometimes all unknown adults can trigger us into fear, even when there's no resemblance to our original abuser. I still occasionally feel triggered when I come across a group of teenagers, because I grew up in a neighbourhood where there were many, many violent ones. For this reason, my son, who is quite empathic, joked that he will not become a teenager when he grows up. Sometimes, someone looking at us, or even noticing us, can trigger us into fear and toxic shame. One of my clients once came in, intensely triggered, because a cat was staring at him. Other common triggers include making a mistake, asking for help, or having to speak in front of a group of people. Moreover, simply feeling tired, sick, lonely, or hungry can sometimes trigger a flashback. Any type of physical pain can also be a trigger. For many survivors, authority figures are the ultimate triggers. I have known several survivors who have never gotten so much as a parking ticket, who cringe in anxiety whenever they come across a policeman or police car. It took me decades to overcome my intense performance anxiety about teaching. Nothing could trigger me more than an upcoming teaching engagement. Fortunately, I was unwilling to give up this activity because I enjoyed it most of the time once I got going. I did not make any real progress beyond learning to white knuckle it until I recognised my performance anxiety as a flashback to the danger of talking at family dinner time. This recognition allowed me to see that I was unconsciously terrified that my parents were going to show up and scoff at me in public. At first, I, my critic, labelled this a preposterous idea. But when I started to imagine and practice aggressively defending myself against them on the drive to my teaching engagement, I soon experienced an enormous reduction in my anxiety. This experience led to me formulating step 6 in the flashback management steps above, as well as my ideas about angering against the critic, which will be explored in the next chapter. The look. A common trigger of emotional flashbacks. Early on, in working with this model, I was surprised that certain clients with relatively moderate childhood abuse were plagued by emotional flashbacks. Most of them, in fact, were quite sure that they had never ever been hit. Many of them, however, would talk about how they hated it when their parents gave them the look. The look, in most cases, is the facial expression that typically accompanies contempt. Contempt is a powerful, punishing visage backed up by an emotional force field of intimidation and disgust. A raised voice can be added intermittently to the look to amp up its power. When a parent gives the look to a child, she is telling him that he is not only in serious jeopardy, but that he is also a sorry excuse for a human being. Over time, the look can make the recipient feel terrified and repugnant, as it drives him into an emotional flashback of fear and shame. When the look is used to control an older child, it commonly flashes her back to an earlier pre-memory, time when the look was empowered by traumatizing punishment. The look rarely terrifies a child into obedience unless it has previously been paired with hitting or other dire consequences. Years of working at parental stress services convinced me that most young children ignore the look unless it was previously accompanied by traumatizing punishment. Typically, the look is empowered via a psychological process called conditioning. Here is a classic example of adversive conditioning. Technicians deliver an electric shock to an animal in a cage. At the same time, they ring a bell. Ding, 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 ding. The animal, of course, has a fearful and distressed response to the shock. It does not, however, take many repetitions of pairing the sound with the shock before the sound alone elicits the same upset response in the animal. This is analogous, I believe, or analogous, to how a child learns to be terrified of the look. With enough pairings of the look with physical punishment or extreme abandonment, the parent can eventually delete the smack and get the same results with just the look. With enough repetitions in early childhood, this pairing can last a lifetime, so that the parent can control the child forever with the look. In my hospice work, I have seen several dying 90-pound mothers still able to put the fear of God into their huge sons with the look. The look, then, is a powerful trigger for making adult survivors flash back to the fear and humiliation of their childhoods. Once again, many of my clients do not remember this because the punishment only had to accompany the look for a few months, while they were toddlers before it became permanently wired as a trigger. Moreover, it is the rare person who has any memory before he is 3 or 4 years old. Unfortunately, the look can continue to work even after the parent dies. There are at least 2 reasons for this. First, we internalise our parents in a way that they can subliminally appear in our imaginations and give us the look whenever we are less than perfect. This includes imperfections in thought, feeling, or action. Sadly, I often see this subliminal look mimicked on the faces of my flashback clients as they scowl contemptuously at themselves. And second, when anyone else looks at us disapprovingly, we can generalise that they are as dangerous as our parents. This is what happened to me in the emotional flashback that I described in Chapter 1. Internal vs external triggers. As we move out of early recovery, we begin to observe that internal triggers are even more common than external ones. Such triggers are commonly the nasty spawn of the inner critic. Typically, they are thoughts and visualizations about endangerment or the need for perfection. The survivor may, seemingly without reason, visualize someone being abusive. Moreover, he can also seemingly, out of the blue, worry himself into a flashback by simply thinking he is not perfectly executing a task that he is undertaking. He can also frighten himself by enumerating the many ways that he might mess up any upcoming task. When internal triggering is at its worst, small potato miscues and peccadillos trigger us into a full-blown emotional flashback. We then devolve into a polarised process of negative noticing and incessant preoccupation with defects and hazards. We perseverate about everything that has gone or could go wrong. As recovery progresses, many survivors are shocked to discover that the majority of their flashbacks are triggered internally by these types of inner critic programs. We will explore below, and in the next 2 chapters, the way we can rescue ourselves from the critic's internal triggering processes. Progressive trigger recognition. With ongoing recovery, we become more knowledgeable about our triggers and avoid them when practical. Identifying our triggers also helps us to get into flashback management mode more quickly. Recognition further aids us to handle unavoidable triggering situations. Forethought allows us to prophylactically practice flashback management before we get activated, as I did in the performance anxiety situation mentioned earlier. Recognising the moment of triggering is even more important than recognising the trigger itself. This is because flashbacks sometimes start out subtly and then progressively become more intense. Early recognition, therefore, helps us to invoke the steps earlier, and decrease the intensity and duration of the flashback. Finally, resolving a flashback requires rebalancing, significant biochemical changes in the brain and body that take time to subside. For example, over-adrenalization sometimes dramatically morphs into the hangover of adrenaline exhaustion before the adrenal function can be rebalanced. Decreasing the intensity of a flashback with quick remedial action decreases the time it takes for our physiology to recover. Signs of being in a flashback. We can often find ourselves in a flashback without ever having seen the flash. There are a variety of clues that we can learn to identify as signs that we are caught in a flashback. This is essential to recovery as naming our experience. Flashback. Step number 1 in flashback management. Often, immediately brings some relief. Even more importantly, it points us in the direction of working the other 12 steps of flashback management. One common sign of being flashed back is that we feel small, helpless and hopeless. In intense flashbacks, this magnifies into feeling so ashamed that we are loath to go out or show our face anywhere. Feeling fragile, on edge, delicate and easily crushable is another aspect of this. The survivor may also notice an evaporation of whatever self-esteem he has earned since he left home. This is a flashback to the childhood years where implicit family rules forbade any self-esteem at all. Another common clue that we are flashing back is an increase in the virulence of the inner or outer critic. This typically looks like increased drasticising and catastrophizing, as well as intensified self-criticism or judgmentalness of others. A very common example of this is lapsing into extremely polarised all or none thinking, such as only being able to see what is wrong with yourself and or others. In my own mid-level recovery, I learned that when I was feeling especially judgmental of others, it usually meant I had flashback to being around my critical parents. The trigger was usually that some vulnerability of mine was in ascendancy. In response, I then over-noticed others' faults so that I could justify avoiding them and the embarrassment of being seen in a state of not being shiny enough. Another clue that we are in a flashback occurs when we notice that our emotional reactions are out of proportion to what has triggered them. Here are 2 common instances of this. 1, a minor upset feels like an emergency, and 2, a minor unfairness feels like a travesty of justice. In the first instance, You drop a book that you're carrying and launch it into an angry, self-berating tirade that lingers for hours. In the second instance, another driver's relatively harmless, unsignalled lane change triggers you into rageful indignation that reverberates into your psyche for hours. When we are not mindful at such times, we can erupt against ourselves in self-disgust and self-hatred, or we can unfairly explode out against the relatively innocent other. On the other hand, we can choose healthy flashback management once we recognise these examples as flashbacks to the real emergencies and injustices of our childhood. Furthermore, we can harvest recovery out of these unpleasant flashbacks by seeing them as proof that we were traumatised. When we do the latter, we can morph our anger into healthy indignation about the outrageously unfair conditions of our upbringing. More on self-medication. Another clue about being in a flashback is an increased use of primitive self-soothing techniques. Another clue about being in a flashback is an increased use of primitive self-soothing techniques. Many survivors learn early in life to manage their painful feelings with food, distracting activities, or mood-altering substances. Over time, self-medication can become habitual and devolve into substance or process addictions. With self-medication, I believe there is a continuum of severity that stretches from occasional use on one end to true addiction on the other. For many survivors, self-medication is a matter of degree. An especially strong urge to use more substance or process than normal is a powerful clue that you are in a flashback. With practice, mindfully noticing a sudden upsurge in craving can be interpreted as the need to invoke the flashback management steps. Moreover, I see many survivors gradually decrease their self-medicating habits by effectively using these steps. Flashbacks and therapy sessions. This section is for survivors who are in the therapy of contemplating starting it. Over the years, I have noticed that as survivors feel safe enough with me, opportunities arise more frequently for working with flashbacks during sessions. Sometimes it even seems that some part of them schedules their flashbacks to occur just prior to or during our session. It is as if they are looking for on-the-job training in flashback management. Some therapists describe this as regression into the service of building the healthy ego. I recently experienced this with a client who rushed into my office 5 minutes late, visibly flushed and anxious. She opened the sessions by exclaiming, "I'm such a loser! I can't do anything right! You must be sick of working with me." This was someone who had, on previous occasions, been moved by my validation of her ongoing accomplishments in our work. Based on what she had uncovered about her mother's punitive perfectionism in previous sessions, I was certain that being late had triggered her into an emotional flashback. In this moment, she was experiencing right brain emotional dominance and a decrease in left brain rational thinking, as so often happens in a flashback. She temporarily lost access to her post-childhood knowledge and understanding. This appears to be a mechanism of dissociation, and in this instance, it rendered my client amnesiac of my high regard for our work together. I believe this type of dissociation also accounts for the recurring disappearance of previously established trust that commonly occurs with emotional flashbacks. As we progress in our recovery, we learn that flashbacks can cause us to forget that our proven allies are in fact still reliable. With enough practice, however, we can learn to interpret feelings of distrust with proven friends as evidence that we are in a flashback. We are flashing back to our childhoods when no one was trustworthy. Grieving resolves flashback. Step number 9. Returning to the above vignette, I wondered out loud to my client, "Do you think you might be in a flashback?" Because of the numerous times we had previously identified her emotional upsets as flashbacks, she immediately recognised this and let go into deep sobbing. She dropped into profound grieving. Her crying combined tears of relief with tears of grief. Her tears of relief came from being able to take in my empathy. Her tears of grief were the feelings of her abject childhood pain being released. Her tears of relief also came from once again remembering the source of this previously confusing and overwhelming pain.